One of the most remarkable and frankly strange movements of the modern era is without a doubt the Taliban. More than just about any other movement or group I've ever looked at, they really defy easy classification, and there's not really a category you can put them into. While they have aspects of an ethno-nationalist movement, a tribal movement, a Islamic revivalist movement, a cult, a millenarian movement, and a political party, they really don't fit into any of these categories. As well, they might have some overlap. The majority of however you want to define them, just doesn't fit into any individual category. It's a very strange mixture of different elements that you just don't really see anywhere else. So, for instance, they're an Islamic fundamentalist movement that's unrelated to Wahhabism, Salafism, the Muslim Brotherhood, or any of the indigenous Islamic movements. They're a brand new movement that came about during the late 80s and early 90s. While much of the leadership are former mujahideen, a lot of them are young students. Just to kind of do a slight digression, so a Talib is a student at a madrasa, so Taliban is the students of God, or a group of students. So a lot of them, probably a majority of the rank and file, were not mujahideen. They were people who grew up in the refugee camps and madrasas during the Soviet War, unlike a lot of the other groups that were very heavily dominated by former mujahideen. As far as we can determine, they have absolutely no political program beyond the implementation of Sharia law. And despite not being a millenarian movement, they have a very millenarian attitude towards governance. When asked, how are you going to provide food for the country? I believe it was Mullah Omar who said, Allah will provide, which once again is a very kind of millenarian mindset. We don't really have to worry about the long term because the world is going to end. And they don't really seem to have that, but they very much have that kind of attitude towards governance. Unlike a lot of Islamist and conservative Muslim movements, they're extremely anti-intellectual and seem to reject most aspects of Islamic jurisprudence beyond a very base level interpretation of the Quran and I think the Hadiths. Although a lot of their interpretation of Sharia is just Pashtun tribal customs painted with an Islamic veneer. Despite coming out of nowhere, they succeeded in overrunning something like 90% of the country and defeating all of the warlords who had much better trained and equipped armies than themselves. In a country that's based on forming coalitions, they compromised with basically nobody, and it somehow worked out for them. Like I said, the whole thing is very strange, and you can't really put it into the kind of categories we would expect, like a communist guerrilla movement. That makes sense. Kind of a millenarian religious cult. That makes sense. Some sort of pan-Islamic socialism or Wahhabism or something like that. These are all the kind of things that we would expect, but it doesn't really fit into any of these categories. So this video is based off of the book Taliban, Militant Islam, Oil and Fundamentalism in Central Asia by Pakistani journalist Ahmed Rashid. What's kind of interesting about this is the book was written in 2000 before the invasion of Afghanistan. So everything about this is pre-invasion, which I actually think is really good because it doesn't cover 9/11, and that would kind of taint everything, and everything would be reevaluated within the context of 9/11. So the Taliban was founded by a man named Omar, or Mullah Omar, or Emir, or the supreme leader of the Taliban if you want to translate it into English. And the Taliban is almost entirely composed of Pashtuns from the southern part of Afghanistan. Like I said, almost entirely their leadership is drawn from the Pashtun ethnic group, and specifically from Pashtuns in southern Afghanistan. Later on, they would ally with Pashtuns from eastern Afghanistan, and they would sideline them. They would allow them to be cannon fodder in their army, but they refused to give them any positions of power. Now, to kind of summarize what the people are like in this area, take the most extreme derogatory characterization of a redneck, like someone who just is obsessed with guns, who's extremely violent, who engages in incest, who shoots anyone who comes into their town. Take the most extreme interpretation of that, then multiply it by about 10, and you more or less have the Pashtuns in southern Afghanistan. They are a people very well known for their ferocity and martial toughness. Frequently throughout the history of the Indian subcontinent, you would have dynasties in Afghanistan or Central Asia composed of Pashtuns or other people in the area who would go down, invade India, and conquer large portions of it because they were such a fierce group. Another important thing to keep in mind about the Pashtuns and about Afghanistan in general is Afghanistan is one of the most religiously Muslim states in the world. While I'm not super well educated on the communist period, from my understanding, they were not particularly anti-clerical and at some points embraced Islamic socialism. Atheism and secularism are more or less unheard of within Afghanistan, and every government they've had since the Soviet times has had some form of Islamic in the title. Now, looking back to the broader political situation for the moment, the communist regime actually outlasted the Soviet Union by a couple of years, and Najibullah was only overthrown in 1992 when he was replaced by a coalition government made up of some of the Mujahideen, which was, and I'm not joking, called the Islamic State of Afghanistan. What's the old expression? History repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. Now, I'm not even going to attempt to go into all the different factions, all of the different figures involved within Afghanistan at this particular time, but you had a loose federal government that controlled Kabul, Herat, and some of the northeast of the country. I don't know how accurate this map is, but I don't think you can really make an accurate map of some of the Mujahideen. And Afghanistan's a very ethnically diverse country. The Pashtuns, I think, are the plurality. I don't think they're quite the majority, but you have Tajiks and Uzbeks and the Hazara and all these other groups, and they were all in different parts of the country, and they had their own movements. And then just large portions of the country were just ruled by, they call them commanders, but they were warlords who ruled parts of the country as their personal fief and just stole from the common population. There were some areas where they attempted to set up some form of civilian government, but for the most part, the whole thing was just an ongoing mess that went nowhere. And into this comes Mullah Omar, who was a mullah who ran a madrasa. And he started off his group, as I mentioned earlier, from the Talibs, or the students at his school, and they called themselves the Taliban. And initially, they kind of portrayed themselves as being a Robin Hood-esque group. Early on, there was a couple girls who got kidnapped and raped, and the Taliban went in, killed the warlord's soldiers, and hung the guy from a tank. There was another little boy who got kidnapped and sodomized, and they rescued him and killed those people. And very early on, they proved themselves to, I don't know if discipline's the right term because they didn't really have good training, but they were motivated by fanaticism, kind of like the Taipings were. And as a result, their soldiers were very much willing to die and throw themselves into situations where they were almost certainly going to fail. And having this higher cause, kind of a mixture of Pashtun ethnic identity, personal loyalty to Mullah Omar, and this extremely strong sense of religious fanaticism meant that they would stand and fight where the other warlords' troops would just run away because they were just in it for money or prestige or power, and they didn't really believe in anything. And the fact that all power in the movement was completely centralized with Mullah Omar meant that there was no factionalism. There was no obvious rival to him. Later on, once the Taliban would take over the country, they would constantly rotate ministers between portfolios. They'd rotate governors around. They'd rotate the commanders to the military units, which was extremely inefficient and led to constant administrative chaos. But once again, it meant that there was no factions. It meant that no one could go off on their own and set up their own petty kingdoms. And that allowed them to avoid a lot of the problems that the other warlords had. Because what had been happening is you'd have a coalition that would take Kabul, and then it would collapse, and they'd start killing each other. But the Taliban didn't really have any of those issues. In the areas under their control, they refused to really work with any of the other warlords, and they'd kill them and their soldiers or force their submission. If a warlord submitted to them, they would assume their troops into their army, but the warlord themselves would have to retire or be put in a marginalized position, and they wouldn't be allowed to have any kind of authority. So within Taliban controlled areas, they killed all the bandits, they killed all the warlords, they killed all the roving bands, and brought in a very strict interpretation of Sharia law. While this would eventually become a sort of be careful what you wish for situation, as it turned increasingly extreme and nightmarish, at the time, people were very happy about bringing Sharia law. It meant that criminals were brutally punished, murderers and rapists were executed. There was an interesting anecdote at the start of the book where a bandit had tried to steal medication from a guy and had killed him in stealing the medication, and he was caught, and the family of the murdered victim was able to gun him down with an AK in a public execution. And people like public executions. After decades of being preyed upon by bandits and warlords and corrupt scumbags, it was really nice to have someone who just won. So the areas the Taliban controlled were peaceful. The issue is they had no governmental plans. And once they took over the country, they said, we have no real governmental plans. Most Islamist groups have some sort of plan, having a Islamic socialist economy or having like distributist or some sort of capitalism, some sort of modernization plans where they try to synchronize modern technology, modern military, some other modern ideas with traditional Islam. But the Taliban really didn't have any of that because they didn't grow out of an actual Islamic movement. It was basically just whatever Mullah Omar came up with in his largely uneducated interpretation of the Quran. So, I mean, some things like praying 5 times a day or whatever it is, the modesty of women and things like that are traditional Islamic practices. The idea, though, that no one can go to school, women can't at all, and men can't even. Within the 90s, in Taliban-controlled areas, boys didn't even really go to school most of the time. Other things like banning kites, banning music, banning basically any form of entertainment, plays, television, movies, like I said, music, female sporting events, male sporting events still technically existed, but they would stop whenever it was time for praying. Weird restrictions on medical care. There was just all kinds of bizarre stuff that they brought in, which wasn't part of most even fundamentalist interpretations of Islam. From my understanding, the Islamic fundamentalist movements you had in Afghanistan prior to the Taliban, for instance, didn't really see an issue with women being educated, at least at a grade school and perhaps a high school level. Nor was there really, I think, this idea that they weren't allowed to leave the house at all. And once again, I think just to take a step back, something you have to realize about Islam is because it's so heavily based on a legal code, in general, scholarship and education is very important, if not necessarily the arts and sciences, then Islamic law and Islamic history. Because there's all this judicial precedent you have to look at. There's the Quran, there's the Hadiths, there's the different judicial schools. There's all this other stuff, but the Taliban really doesn't know anything about this because they come from a very primitive educational background. But sorry, back to our main story. So, the unwillingness of the Taliban, because of their extreme xenophobia for anyone who wasn't a southern Pashtun from around Kandahar, actually played into their advantage, because it meant they didn't make any alliances with people who would later snake on them, which had been the ongoing issue, is the coalitions would inevitably snake on each other and fall apart. Like I said, Mullah Omar ran the whole thing as a cult, so there was one authority who, whatever he said goes. And that was something no one had seen before. The Taliban also disarmed the population in the areas they conquered. So, like I said, they killed off all the opposition in the areas they conquered. They disarmed the population. There's no real ability to rise up anymore. And while the areas were extremely poorly run, at least there was some measure of peace. Now, this measure of peace attracted a lot of support from the international community, particularly from some of the Central Asian republics and Pakistan. So in Pakistan, the book calls it the transportation mafia. So the transportation mafia, who does smuggling, uh, not only illegal smuggling but like legal transportation of goods. You also have just the mafia, who's involved in smuggling heroin and stuff like that. So when the Soviet Union broke up, you had all these Central Asian republics who had gas and oil and stuff like that. They were also looking to buy goods from the outside world. And because Iran was a hostile international pariah at the time, and Russia was unwilling to let them export things or really import things, as it wanted to maintain its position of hegemony, the obvious trade partner was Pakistan. Unfortunately, though, there's this kind of troll part of Afghanistan here that prevents direct contact with Pakistan. So, as the Taliban were taking over areas in the western half of the country and they killed off the bandits, the Pakistani transport mafia discovered they only had to bribe one person. Previously, they had to bribe dozens of different warlords who would go back on their word, but the Taliban, they just had to pay off once and they could transport stuff across the country. Now, one of the ironies is this would eventually cause a collapse in Pakistan's economy, as this completely porous northern border meant that people were just smuggling immense amounts of all kinds of things. They were importing electronics from Japan through the northern border. It destroyed a lot of the local industries, as cheap goods from China or Japan would be smuggled in and get past the protective tariffs, and they were better quality than whatever was being produced in Pakistan. So it devastated the local industry. The government couldn't collect any kinds of fines or import duties, which made up a large portion of its revenue. The mass exportation of opium led to the predictable consequences of a huge number of drug addicts. Basically, all the provincial governors anywhere close to the border were getting paid off by multiple different parties. And then you had Islamists who crossed the border and started to threaten the Pakistani government. So the whole thing was a disaster. But at the time, Pakistan was like, let's support the Taliban because we have a lot of Pashtuns in our country. They're an anti-Iran force because they're Sunni fundamentalists. And they kind of played into the ISI's dream of like a greater Afghanistan. So to take kind of a side note, so in Pakistan, you have a group called the ISI, who is their intelligence service. And they're more or less completely independent from the government. And they're more powerful than kind of the government and the military combined. And they operate with essentially no oversight, with a huge black budget that's mostly off the books. And anytime you have a terrorist attack in India, it's probably the ISI. They have like a Pakistani supremacist Islamist project, and they will train terrorism and try to start wars and do all this other shady stuff behind the scenes. And they took the Taliban on as their proteges and just started giving them huge amounts of money and weapons and stuff like that. They also got Saudi Arabia on board, and Saudi Arabia started giving them money. And then the Taliban embraced the exportation of opium. The idea is, it's really funny actually, that opium cannot be consumed by Muslims, but since the opium was being sold to Europeans and North Americans who were not Muslim, it was okay then. So the bribes, the funding from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and the opium profits allowed them to just pay off a lot of the warlords and get them to go into exile or give up and go into retirement and stuff like that. And then we start to get additional players involved, as it seems like the Taliban are going to overrun the rest of the country. And so for those of you who aren't aware, there is something called the Great Game, which was a game played between Great Britain and Russia during the 19th century over control of Central Asia. The British wanted to establish a line to keep India safe, whereas the Russians wanted to expand into Central Asia and keep their possessions there safe. And Afghanistan, Tibet, and then Persia kind of served as buffer states. The British briefly invaded Afghanistan, occupied it, and set up a pro British government. But generally speaking, Afghanistan was better off just being neutral, as it prevented the two countries from directly fighting with each other. Kind of like how Mongolia is a good buffer state between Russia and China, as it's this big empty country with no military to speak of that just blocks off a lot of the border. But I digress. So you had a new great game that formed because Central Asia is one of the last places on Earth that has huge reserves of energy, both in terms of oil and natural gas, that hasn't really been exploited. The Soviet Union and Russian Empire got their oil from elsewhere, and to a large extent, the Central Asian republics were just kind of this backwater. But now it's a really big deal that they're not part of Russia anymore. And Pakistan really wants a pipeline because Pakistan can buy cheap energy from the Central Asian republics and not have to deal with Iran and not have to deal with Russia. The Central Asian republics can't sell their oil through Russia because Russia won't let them. And there's basically the only pipelines there are is controlled by Russia. So they can go through Iran, which is an international pariah and is hostile to secular and Sunni regimes. They can try to build something across the Caspian Sea, which is completely impractical. Or they can try to negotiate with the Taliban to build a pipeline across Afghanistan, which is something they tried throughout the 90s. And for brief periods, the US supported the Taliban because they were anti-Iran at the behest of Israel, ironically enough. And then they were anti-Taliban. And the whole thing just was a complete and utter shit show where people kept switching sides. And, okay, the Taliban is good. Now they're not good. It's good for us economically. It's good for the pipeline. It's bad for the pipeline. I know I'm skipping through and summarizing a lot of stuff, but you could write entire books just about all the negotiations and shenanigans that went on with the different players. And so by the end of the 90s, you have a situation that was better and worse than it had been before. 90% of the country was controlled by the Taliban, but it was kind of nightmarish within these areas. You had one of the most totalitarian, brutal governments in human history that had a network of informers through the religious police in all aspects of Afghan society, and basically no one was safe, and most of the population lived in a constant state of terror. The Taliban had no plans for civilian governance. I think the book says most of the government employees in Kabul only worked a couple hours a day. They had purged most of the doctors, all of the professional civil servants, and technical people. They closed the universities and public schools down. It made no actual attempt at rebuilding the country on the grounds that we'll figure something out once the civil war's over, or Allah will provide. So things got better, but they also got worse. In a sense, they got more hopeless. They were more stable in their hopelessness. The Taliban was struggling to try to take that last bit of the country. Afghanistan was too important to completely ignore, but not important enough to bother invading. Around this time and kind of over the later 90s, Saudi Arabia supported Afghanistan until Mullah Omar insulted the Saudi king, and then Saudi Arabia stopped supporting them. But bin Laden moved there, and the Taliban just invited Islamists from across the world, the more extreme the better. They called them Afghan Arabs, even if they weren't from Arabia, to just come there and to fight on their side. And they would go there to get combat experience, then go back to their home countries and try to start a revolution there using the skills they've learned. And basically, prior to 9/11, this whole thing was just going nowhere. There's an expression that I'm very fond of, dead heat on a merry-go-round. because the people are racing as fast as they can, but it's a merry-go-round. The things are all equally far apart and they can't get closer. So it's just kind of a mess. And that kind of leads us into the situation that we had in 2000 where 9/11 happened and Afghanistan was invading. Now, I'm not super familiar with the course of the Civil War, but more or less, the Northern Alliance with Western help overran most of Afghanistan, reducing the Taliban to some of their traditional tribal areas, or they just fled across the border into Pakistan, and the Northern Alliance took over the country. Although I don't know how much it was the Northern Alliance and how much it was just people the US and the West picked as puppet like rulers who would do what they told them to do and would promote liberalism. The whole thing was just kind of a corrupt mess. And once again, I'm not super familiar about the later period, but I would imagine something similar would happen with the central government being so corrupt, incompetent, incapable of maintaining any sort of order that a lot of the population just preferred the Taliban. Because at least then there was some sort of structure, and the government wasn't really making much progress in rebuilding the country, anyways. An interesting thing I forgot to point out is the Taliban more or less kicked out all of the UN agencies, but it wasn't for like a nationalist reason or a self-sufficiency reason. They just didn't want any scrutiny. And Afghanistan's major industry is actually welfare from the international community, and nothing replaced that. Nothing replaced that. Their policies were so extreme in terms of gender and other things that foreign countries wouldn't support them. So that is more or less the tale of the Taliban, a very strange movement that somehow managed to go from 50 students to taking over the country to getting overthrown and then taking over the country again. One of the great ironies is the current emirate of Afghanistan, the Taliban actually control more of the country than they did prior to it. So, in a sense, it just made the Taliban stronger and did more of a number on their opponents than it actually ever did on them. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. Once again, the book is Taliban, Militant Islam, Oil, and Fundamentalism in Central Asia by Pakistani journalist Ahmed Rashid.